I wanted to say that as the first of the Melbourne-based speakers, and I think Ian also, were delighted to be here. I'm very grateful to the organizers and both of the conference, sort of the intellectual program of the conference and the logistics. It's an honor, and I'm very pleased to have been included. So I am going to talk to you today, as you've just heard, about gold. But I wanted to start quite specifically by saying that, as some of you maybe know, I'm a relatively recent transplant to Melbourne, arrived a couple of years ago. And so as I was preparing this talk, I realized that I owe my job, the fact that I can earn a living, to gold mining. And this in at least two ways that I'm aware of. The first is that Melbourne would not exist without the extraction of gold. Just to sort of remind you, like many Australian settlements then and now, Melbourne was built on a gold rush that began with an 1851 discovery south of the city. In the next decade, Victoria State contributed more than a third of the total world gold output. And this is at the same time that there are gold rushes in California, in Russia, and elsewhere. And Britain, the mother country at that point, paid down all of its existing debts, war debts and others, based on this extracted Aussie wealth. I show you here just the statistics of how the city, the sort of gold fields grew around Melbourne. And also one of these songs, there's a whole kind of heroicizing historiography of this moment. This is a poem. There are also work songs. It really is part of the sort of mythology of this founding moment. But in fact, still, if you visit Melbourne and you go to the Melbourne Museum, one of the prime displays there, in addition to Farlap, who's kind of, there's this horse and his heart and various other details. It is a horse, or it was a horse, I guess. Now it's a simulacrum of a horse, I guess. Anyway, if you go to the Melbourne Museum, one of the prime displays there is a replica of the largest gold nugget ever found, by most accounts, the Welcome Stranger of 1862. And I'm showing you what's in the museum, and then some guy off the internet who made a copy of this out of plaster to give you some sense of the scale of this thing. So this weighed 78 kilograms, or 173 pounds, and it generated 157 pounds of 24-karat gold metal. So this is why we have replicas of it. So I have to say, I think it was a prototypically dry Australian humor that set the world's largest gold-tone pyramid to represent Victoria State at the Great London Exhibition in 1862. You see a representation of it here. The size of the pyramid corresponded to the total volume of gold extracted from Victoria to that date. And the little men that you see with the tub beside the pyramid, so here basically, are in John Nash's image, are explaining to the metropolitans how one pans for the metal in Antipodean riverbeds. So that's the first link. The second link between my job and gold mines is much more discipline specific. My home field is 14th and 15th century Italian painting. That is, I work on what is still occasionally called goldback or gold ground painting. The terms are a little old-fashioned, but if we take a typical work, like Simone Martini and Lippo Memmi's 1333 Annunciation, done for the cathedral in central Italy in Siena, it's easy to see why these terms have persisted, why they existed, why they persist. Almost the entire visible surface here is gold, and I call your attention also just to the sheer size of this. And this gold has been worked in almost every imaginable way. To create the Angel Gabriel's clothes, for instance, egg tempera, which is the pigment medium here, was laid over a gold leaf ground, and then scratched away and finished with more translucent oil-based varnishes to create the shading. And there's just a detail of that to show you what this looks like. And you've also got the application of gold leaf that then is punched with tools and metal tools and other things freehand to give you this sort of decoration on the bands. The cluster of angels and the dove that surround the Holy Spirit about to overshadow Mary are made entirely of varnishes over bare gold metal and then scratched and manipulated, including with the wooden tip of the artist's brush. This was a moment in European visual arts when gold could literally form celestial bodies. And so that even at the end of the 15th century, when most gold brown painting had gone out of fashion, had fallen away, Carlo Crivelli could use a sudden kind of flat gold background coming down against the sky to signify the eclipse that the Bible recorded at the crucifixion. Essentially, this blackening of sight, it's like the creeping recursion of this older metallic visual system is actually being used to suggest this failing of light and vision. So in my talk today, I want to think about this gold, and specifically about where it came from, how it was imagined or understood, and why this might matter in the context of this larger project. Basically, I think if it has a place here, it's because it can help us to push against what's often a kind of default historiographical moralism, too easily tying gold and shine to surfeit, decadence, or good old-fashioned conspicuous consumption. If Giuliano Bruno is right that a surface, like a screen, is an architecture of relations, a partition that can be shared, that we could, for instance, think of a painting surface in those terms, then I think the gold of gold grounds seems to have functioned a bit like one-way mirrors in police stations, which reflect back to deny any exchange or engagement. Our own post-Freudian perspective can make it hard to think beyond what are, fundamentally recalcitrant surfaces. Michael Taussig reminds us that both Freud and Bataille were, for instance, quite clear on the link between gold and filth. Freud, as you know, famously linked the retention of feces by the anal stage child to the hoarding of gold by the adult misers he thought those children would become. Sorry, there's a detail of that, just to give you the sense of you see the work, but you can't see into or beyond it. And particularly, in conditions of candlelight, for instance, gold really stops your vision in many, many ways. Nor is this a new link if we take sublimation to be its core. This is an Aussie product which we can bring. The medieval abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, for instance, describing his glittering golden liturgical treasures, justified them by claiming that they led his mind from the excrement of the mundane, that's the word, to a limited human understanding of heaven. There's this kind of sublimation that's supposed to take place. Taussig, for his part, tells a story about a drug lord in Colombia who wiped himself with toilet paper embossed with his own initials in gold leaf, thereby, Taussig notes, returning gold to shit. And I would just point out that Aussie retailers got there before him in some ways. Our own era has embraced this link, from the gold-covered chicken wings recently featured in the New Yorker. Apparently, if you live in and around Brooklyn, you can get them for $45 US dollars for 10. Or, famously, Maurizio Cattelan's America, which we'll hear more about, I think, in the next paper. Gold is unreactive with the human body. So the chicken wing covering, or the gold of, for instance, Absolute or Kettle One, vodka, to name only one of a whole series of examples, will in fact simply get shat out in the end. Good. The use of gold in early modern, so that's our moment, one of our understandings. But the use of gold in early modern Italy came after centuries of gold-backed icons in Byzantine traditions. So it's not like it was a new thing. But it served to define a heuristic category, and this is part of my interest in it. That's the International Gothic. I give you an online definition here. That's been used as a kind of temporal holding place for the 14th and 15th century, but also is used to point to a style of sumptuous materials displaced by Renaissance realism and framed as a kind of artistic dead end. It's interesting to me that a lot of the kind of good and great of historical art history have looked at this category, sometimes in great detail. So Panofsky, for instance, wrote of artificial glitter and, I'm quoting him, an inflationary spiral of social overstatement created, he claimed, by the anxiety of an old aristocracy in decline and threatened by the rising, again, I'm quoting him, proto-capitalist class. Which I have to say was an expression I was a little surprised to find Panofsky using. Gombrich, for his part, noted that the taste for gold and shiny things is a universal human trait, but then we typically and ideally grow out of it. He then evoked both Veblen's idea of conspicuous consumption and what Gombrich called the logic of Vanity Fair to conclude that the style, International Gothic, faded because of surfeit, and that is his word that I borrow, and technical advances like perspective. And it's easy to pull in Leon Battista Alberti's 1435 condemnation of painters using gold to make gold to bolster this sort of case. Yet the gold of goldbacks had its own very particular history, and that's what I now want to sort of move through with you. I think it's interesting for us in thinking through some of these associations, some of the ways in which these embedded histories of mining and extraction actually have stayed with us and have shaped where we are, and particularly the canon that we also work with. So a little bit of background just to remind you. Gold is a fairly rare mineral in the Earth's crust with about 2.5 grams of the metal per 1,000 metric tons of rock on average. It is also vastly more common now in the modern world than it was before the 19th century, after new mines were opened in South Africa and elsewhere. In Europe, in Roman antiquity, gold had been mined in Spain, and throughout the Middle Ages, there were mines in Serbia, what's now Serbia, Croatia, Greater Hungary, and Germany. But the first major post-antique European mine in Serbia opened in 1252, and only the exporting of gold from Hungary in the mid-14th century seems to have made much of a difference to the available volumes of ore. Yet the Sienese Annunciation I'm showing you here is more than 3 meters high and 2 meters wide, and that's without its frame. And this is only a mid-sized goldback or gold ground painting in this period. The size is symptomatic because, in fact, Italy was awash with gold in this moment, almost all of it, however, from sub-Saharan Western Africa. Basically, the gold of these paintings comes typically from gold coins, which start to be minted as a currency of record in Italy in 1252. Both Florence and Genoa, which are big trading partners, start to do this. Artists would get their gold for gold leaf. Basically, there were specialist workers who did this, called gold beaters, batiloro, literally. And these, the relations of how much gold you could get from a given coin, the coins are almost 24 karat pure. The number of gold leaves you could get was usually set by statute. Typically it was 100. So, we still actually use the same, if you buy gold leaf now, modern sizes, and the gold cushions that are used to work with this are still that. So it was beaten very, very thin is the general point. Artists also seem to have taken scrap gold and the scrap metal and melted that down as well. So, and the general background for all of this is a kind of enormous increase of trade with Italy as a sort of middleman into Eurasia. So the Europeans, and particularly the Italians, are looking for gold because they need a bigger currency to start basically trading these accounts of trade. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I'm happy to talk more later if people are specifically interested. The surplus of gold was a recent phenomenon in Europe, but African gold was a very old commodity in the Islamic and Indian Ocean trade world. Ghana, the land of gold, is already mentioned in the late 700s by the Baghdad geographer Al-Faziri. And in the 10th century, An Arabian writer claimed that the mines of the kingdom of Ghana were the most productive in the world. What he seems to have meant the mines of Bambouk, the Bambouk region on the Senegal River. And just throughout this paper, obviously, I'm using these modern designations of areas and nation states, but just a reminder that they are often anachronistic. Those are still mines, incidentally, that are used. In the late 12th century, however, the rise of the Kingdom of Mali on the Niger River, and I show you its, on the right, its historical extension, and the left shows you the modern geopolitical divisions here. It's a little confusing because the historical kingdom does not fully correspond with the modern nation state of Mali. Anyway, the rise of the Kingdom of Mali on the Niger River shifted and increased the volume of this gold trade. With the strength and stability of the Mali state, new mines were opened upriver in the Bouré region in what is now west central Guinea. The gold extracted was brought downriver to the capital and then ferried across the Sahara by Berber caravans running north through modern Mali or Mauritania into the Maghreb, where it was exchanged for salt and other commodities. By the 13th century, the major northern terminus of this trade was in modern Tunisia, then controlled by the Hafsid dynasty. In 1223, the Genoese established a permanent factory in Tunis to trade directly with this dynasty in Timbuktu. And in the 1230s, this kingdom in Tunisia signed trade agreements with Pisa, Venice, Genoa, and the Kingdom of Sicily, meaning that most gold coming into Europe entered on Italian and especially Venetian and Genoese ships. And what's going south is out of Europe, particularly silver, and then salt from this Maghrebi mining trade. That's the bald mechanics. But something of the true human horror of this trade can be glimpsed from the travel account of Ibn Battuta. And this is just to show you those trade routes. And then here we go. Who was a jurist and traveler from Morocco who followed this trade route south. In the autumn of 1351, Ibn Battuta left Fez and traveled to Sijil Massa. And you see here the remains of the archaeological site of Sijil Massa. He then pushed south as far as Tagasa, which is in northern Mali now, which took him a further 25 days. The town disgusted him. It was situated on a dry salt lake where salt was mined. The water was awful, and the settlement was infested with the worst flies he claimed he had ever seen anywhere. And you know, this is a man who traveled all through the Indian Ocean world, so that was quite a claim. Shelters and dwellings were improvised out of salt slabs as a construction material with camel skin roofs, inhabited by the slaves who worked carving out these huge blocks of salt crystal to be transported south in pairs on the backs of the camels. Ibn Battuta tells us that these slaves sometimes starved to death because food supplies from the outside simply were too slow to reach them. Ibn Battuta then set out south with a caravan party ferrying this salt south across the Sahara. It took him almost 2 months to make this further 1,600-kilometer trip. The lice were so bad that travelers wore small bags of mercury at their necks, even though it killed them as well as the lice. A member of the party left the main group and was never seen again, although they passed the rotting corpse of someone else. As they got farther south, the heat was so intense that they could only travel at night. And then there were the snakes. One man lost a finger to snake bite. When they reached the Niger River and moved upriver to the capital of the Kingdom of Mali, the Muslim cleric seems to have hated most of what he saw, particularly the relations between men and women shocked him. You know, he didn't feel it was a good Muslim empire, and also he didn't feel they gave him enough gifts, frankly. He was someone who... No, I mean, there's an account of Ibn Battuta that basically talks of how he goes around Muslim states as someone who's a traveler and therefore entitled to alms, basically looking for gifts and surviving on them for decades, more or less. But he noted correctly that the emperor's profuse gold came from an unknown place much farther upriver that was subject to the ruler. So in fact, it's the control at the capital of this further source that is unknown that he's signaling. He added that the men of this region were cannibals, And he claimed that a party of them had visited during his stay and had eaten a female slave given to them as a gift. All of this makes the shine of Italian goldbacks a little less shiny, and it's not in any sense buried in the past. As recently as this past November, at least 17 people were killed in disputes exactly in this mining region on the Guinea-Mali border. So all of this raises, that's the mechanics of it, right? All of this, however, raises a basic question. What associations did this West African gold have, if any, for the Italian artists and viewers who then use it? This is a kind of map that shows you that basically Europeans knew little of Africa. They did not make Ibn Battuta's journey, although some did try to cut out the middlemen. In 1291, for instance, 2 Genoese traders set off for West Africa by sea, and were never seen again. They were trying to reach the gold fields. Religious links with East Africa may also have provided some sporadic information about sub-Saharan regions, as in 1306, when the Emperor of Christian Ethiopia sent 30 envoys to Europe, possibly seeking allies in crusades against his Muslim neighbors and enemies. But for all intents and purposes, European knowledge of Africa stopped at the coast. As you see here, that is the end of the sort of Maghrebis Eastern Mediterranean link. Still, one of the only things that Europeans, elite Europeans in particular, knew about Africa was that it produced gold. And that fact was of intense interest. Maps of the period consistently make the link, as for instance this 1376 Catalan Atlas, a summum of what Europeans knew about the world, gifted from the ruler of Catalonia to the new French king. So this really was the kind of state of the art at the time, and I'm showing a section of this. The map includes, there we go, the Lord of Mali with a gold crown and orb in hand, and Tagaza and Gaugao are even located nearby. He's kind of correctly situated. This is a detail of it. There's a caption here in Catalan that notes, this black lord is called Musa Meli, Lord of the Blacks of Guinea, and it adds, so abundant is the gold found in his country that he is the richest and most noble king in all the land. This is in fact a historical figure, Mansa, meaning emperor, ruler, Musa I, who had ruled in Mali from 1312 and who went on pilgrimage through Alexandria and Egypt to Mecca in 1324-25. Musa I brought so much, with his retinue, brought so much gold through Alexandria that it was claimed they had collapsed the local currency value in the trading state there. This is still debated, but there was this, within this kind of lifetime, there had been this memory of this ruler from this region coming through with gold on a scale that no one had ever seen. Similarly, around 1350 or 60, an anonymous Spanish writer narrated an imaginary journey clearly following a map very like this, and he claimed, in a perfect reverse of actual practice, that he, I'm quoting, went by the Sahara with some Moors who are taking gold to the king of Guinea on camels. He name-checked Sijilmassa on the way to what he called the country of the river of gold. Beyond this, he claimed, lay the mountains of the moon and the mountains of gold, where, he tells us, they collect the gold in the anthills, which the ants make on the riverbanks. So you could get gold out of the sort of anthills on the riverbanks. That's a story, incidentally, that goes back to the ancient Greek writer Herodotus, although he placed it somewhere in the kind of Indian East. This last point that I make about these origins is important, I think, because it points to a much longer and larger imaginary in European thinking about gold. Contact and new knowledge coexisted, but I would argue did not displace these older associations. In Christian Europe, gold's origins were ultimately linked, or could be, to divine history. The Bible spoke of the river of the land of gold as one of the 4 rivers watering paradise, and the Spanish writer I just mentioned claimed, in fact, that his river of gold was this same river. In the first book of Kings, chapter 10, King Solomon is said to have collected tribute amounting to 666 talents, or roughly 39,960 pounds of gold. And the heavenly city described in Apocalypse, so last book of the Bible and describing the end of time, was said to have been fashioned all of gold with gems for its walls. More than this, gold also had properties of its own, and we would call these uncanny aspects of this metal. Gold was the heaviest metal then known, and according to authorities like the scholar Albertus Magnus, so 12th century, it was also the most pure because it held the greatest heat and minimal imperfections. This is why he said it was shining and yellow like the sun, and a perfect blend of the mercury and the sulfur that were then claimed to make up all metals. So the reason gold doesn't react for them is that it's the highest and most perfected form of what all metals and all naturally occurring things, inorganic things would be. This is why it was perfectly unreactive in our terms, and thus incorruptible outside of human time. According, for instance, to Alexander Neckham's 13th century on Things of Nature, De Naturis Rerum, I'm quoting, "Gold is correctly compared with wisdom because it is not weakened in the long duration of time." This is part of the reason that gold featured especially throughout Europe as a medicine and a tonic, ingested on food and drunk in a concoction known as aurum potabile, literally drinkable gold. What I'm showing you here is this here is an illustration to accompany gold and an inscription in a book that's essentially an herbal telling you how various plants and things can improve your health. And what it tells you about gold here is that it's hot and dry, it's perfected, and that it's good for all diseases and prolongs life, basically. That's what the inscription says. This aurum potabile that I mentioned, gold is obviously not, it doesn't break down in water, therefore had to involve highly corrosive substances, nitric acid, for instance, or caustics like urine, alcohol, or vinegar. A few years ago, it was determined that the fabled Diane of Poitiers, mistress of the French King Henry II, died eventually because of a daily dose she took of aurum potabile, in this case gold chloride and diethyl ether. Although this kept her hair fine and blonde and her face as white as snow, it turns out anemia is one side effect, it unfortunately also eats away at your teeth and bones and eventually poisoned her to death. This said, there was seemingly no end to the ways in which gold was imagined to suspend normal human bodily processes and decay in time. There's a book, for instance, from the area around Venice in the 14th century, which among its 89 recipes, mostly for color, dyes for clothing, and hair dyes, includes a potion made with gold described as aqua ad deodorandum. It's basically deodorant. Which is taking our gold vodka and so on, even one system beyond that. So if we let go of Veblen, for instance, for a moment and think a little bit instead about this polyvalence and this older relation to divine power and time, these spaces of the divine, these spaces beyond, sort of at the edges of the known world, the gold of goldbacks, I think, becomes semantically richer than simply surface or socio-historical surfeit. And I think this is why the most innovative artists of this age, in fact, use gold particularly to mark what we would call artistic agency or authorship in an age that is not obviously using that sort of vocabulary. So to conclude, I'm just going to finish with this sort of final example from this period. The Strozzi Altarpiece, or Adoration of the Magi Altarpiece, done in 1423 in Florence by an artist called Gentile da Fabriano, which is almost unbelievably complex technically. It's also very large again. Egg tempera is not a gestural medium, right? This is egg yolk with pigment suspended in it. It does not blend particularly, and you cannot mark time, process, authorship through brushwork, for instance, as you might build up with oil. Gentile, however, developed a technique of alternating fast and loose and very tight, small sort of parallel strokes, so that the matte tempera, and it is quite matte, almost shimmers and shimmies from a distance. So it's basically he's using the technique to do exactly what the properties of this stuff doesn't really do. The effect can be seen, for instance, in a tiny detail like this stag at the center back, sort of thrown in for interest, beyond the monkeys, just because you have to have monkeys, or in the horse's flesh and the worked bridles, which are themselves then scratched into gold leaf and built up with gesso, so plaster with gold over it. This technique is a virtuoso optical effect, but the gold then plays a kind of decisive claim in furthering this sort of notion of mastery and process here. To take a single example, the red doublet of one single attendant of the three kings who visit Jesus, by no means a major figure in this story, has been built up by putting down a leaf of gold, scratching it with a metal or a wooden tool in tiny parallel shimmering strokes, and then covering the whole in a red oil glazing that's thinned out as the color comes forward into the notional light. Now, of course, painting on gold leaf also is technically difficult, right? It doesn't adhere as it should be, but so he's basically building this color out of this very inorganic surface, we would say, out of this very uncanny sort of surface. Or the hairnet on one of the midwives who had helped Mary to deliver is delicately traced in gold, while the others is of silver with gold layered onto it. Gold over gesso, so plaster, pastilia as it's called, is used only in the front center, I would argue, to kind of stop the eye in a clump that actually projects notionally out from the closest plane into our space. So the least illusionistic, let's say, use of this, the least spatial use of it, is actually being used to sort of blur that frontal plane. So Gentile is using one of the least flexible visual media, or mediums, gold, to further rather than to undermine representation. Just as gold leaf arguably held a different relation to human time and decay, he's pointing to this as, as close, this I would argue is as close to a self-consciously time-layered and gestural painting as tempera can get. And you need gold to be there with those associations to do it. It's using the least tractable and most perfected substance to make something else, in a claim of artistic skill and self-consciousness about the act of representing that I think few contemporary viewers could have missed. In all this fictive depth, the gold ground hovers at the very limits of the spandrels, at the edge and visual of the horizon, almost as an index of what underlays the whole. And this may be why this same artist often chose gold and gold work, as here, to sign his name and authorship and to mark his kind of agency on many of his other works. You will know that gold is everywhere in art making these days. I'm fascinated by this. From Yves Klein's Tableau d'Or, first made in 1963 and still editioned every year for our new global market, or the Danish artist Dan Vaux's 2011 Coca-Cola, a record-setting auction of gold leaf on discarded or found cardboard. We have gold in our skincare, gold sneakers, although only the padlocks here are 24 karat, and of course those gold chicken wings I mentioned. All very excessive, but perhaps also compensatory. Promised, beyond the way of the stupid display of stupid wealth here, is the ability to stop or stall the normal bodily processes of being within time. All the facial products are anti-aging, which is not so surprising. But Klein's gold bodies, for instance, and endless empty tables have stopped the cycle of ingestion, digestion, and decay that keeps us alive, rather like King Midas starving because all the food and drink he touched turned to gold at his touch in mythology. So this older gold, I think, these older ideas in some ways still haunt us. And so I'll end where I began, in gold in Australia, with a piece by the artist-architect Aram Muradian called A Comprehensive Atlas of Gold Fictions. It turned on Australia's continuing mining wealth. According to the Government Division Geoscience Australia, the country still has the world's single largest gold reserves and is second only to China in volume of production. And we were talking this morning about this sort of idea of the sublime around these photos, right? This is a perfect example of this. Till 2016, this was the largest open pit mine. It's not anymore. It was supplanted. But the sense of the human is completely gone here, and this almost, it's like the Grand Canyon or something that's been created in these kind of striking striations. So the artist has taken the work of this area and this global commodity landscape of open pits and cyanide and arsenic blasts, and he's linked it to a much older one, the songlines of First Peoples that tell the stories and store the memories of this same landscape and lands. Just to show you some of the, the piece was first displayed. There's a kind of book that starts with the Big Bang, where all the metal of the world starts to come into being. There are photographs of these mining sites, and then there are a series of smaller pieces that are sort of recording both personal and other histories. Like these. The little nugget on the far side is actually has a poem of the lover that this thing is notionally supposed to have belonged to recorded within it, and so on. The other is supposed to be a machine for playing this, or this, which is a series of the song lines of the First Peoples of this same Kalgoorlie region that have been encoded into the gold itself. As a kind of recording medium. The point is to create a kind of Fort Knox for the reserves of memory, personal, territorial, and political. What's interesting, I think, is that the gold here becomes the recording instrument, a reminder that the sense of gold's preternatural duration is still, or once again, very much with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark, for the introduction, and I'm quite nervous to be stepping up here after Anne's brilliant paper. I am not an expert on gold by any means. I just have been reflecting on recent news stories and was inspired to think a little bit more about gold in the context of putting this event together. Some of you may be familiar with this story already, but in the news that broke earlier this year, we learned that the American president, which you probably know, Donald Trump's request to borrow Vincent van Gogh's 1888 Landscape with Snow, this painting, to decorate the White House private suites was turned down by the Guggenheim Museum. Nancy Spector, the curator, offered in its place this artwork entitled America, a fully functioning 18-karat gold toilet by the Italian contemporary artist Maurizio Cattelan. However slapstick the press and Twitter users made the Guggenheim's move out to be, so this is, just like a news article, and then at the top it's like someone created a Twitter account called Trump's Gold Toilet. So this is made out to be a kind of this like silly thing that happened. That there's actually I think there's quite a lot more there, that it's not just laughs that's embedded in this sort of art, has been seen as a kind of art world joke. Reports of this turn of events has tended to stick to the obvious. So the American public, and probably you too in Australia, know that Trump has these very exuberantly gilded residences where he clearly showcases his love of this precious material that signals luxury and wealth. And so in a sense, the toilet episode equates to an art-smart kind of mockery of Trump's reputation for crass ostentation. While this museum meets politics encounter is certainly that, I'm not disputing that this is kind of like the way we should understand it, it also engages, I think, with a history of gold in particularly thoughtful ways. So both Catalan in producing the artwork and Spector in offering it, so the correspondence that has since been publicized, showcases the ways in which the histories of art, class, and economy are entangled in gold's mineral politics. So in making this claim, I'm assuming that there's a certain deliberateness about this turn of events. Spector, in her correspondence with, actually this is a correspondence between the curator and the White House curator who works for the president, informing her that the Van Gogh is impossible to loan and so on, and suggesting that Catalan's America is an alternative, seems to suggest that this offer is the artist's idea rather than her own. So fortuitously, she writes, a marvelous work by the celebrated contemporary Italian artist Maurizio Catalan is coming off view today after a year's installation at the Guggenheim. And he would like to offer it to the White House for long-term loan. So when asked actually about Trump's influence on the piece America, Catalan, who conceived of the work before Trump's presidential campaign, has said that Trump must nevertheless have been a cultural reference in the air at the time. So with Spector as his collaborator, it seems that America may well have been destined for Trump after all, that the Trump White House is really its imagined site of installation. And so those are the kind of assumptions that I'm working with. But we should go back to the context of the loan itself. In requesting Van Gogh's landscape with snow, Trump was following the example of many presidents before him. It is quite routine for newly inaugurated presidents to borrow artworks from major museums to decorate the White House, which is, after all, a kind of national gallery of sorts. Even if designated for the family suites, as this particular request was, presidential taste is often scrutinized for its political agenda. So take, for instance, the artworks chosen by the Obamas in 2009, which was published in the Washington Post and other mainstream newspapers. So not surprisingly, the Obamas selected a number of African American artists. One of the several of the works that they used to hang in the White House were by the Harlem Renaissance artist William H. Johnson, who favored, on the left you see he was an artist that deliberately adopted a kind of naive style to depict African American life, and in that way garnered a lot of interest from non-African American audiences. And as well, the Obamas hung more edgier contemporary Black artists like Glenn Ligon, whose piece on the right directly engages difficult questions about race relations. The Obamas' choices also skewed modern and contemporary. So from serenely beautiful abstractions like the Joseph Albers on the left, Albers being this German exile artist who became an important teacher of many abstract expressionists, to more lighthearted pieces like the Ed Ruscha word painting on the right, which is really as a kind of play on the rhetoric of indecision, cleverly chosen for a presidential residence. So in a sense, the Obama White House was showcasing something of the tenor of the presidency with their artistic choices. Those, that is, youthful but intellectual, energetic, and risk-taking, all the while celebrating a new diversity in national leadership with the inclusion of internationally regarded Black artists of the past and present. So all this is to say that Trump's request and the Guggenheim's refusal surely puts more at stake than simple aesthetic preference. Trump's choice is likely one designed to demonstrate his anti-elitist image as well as his investor's acumen when it comes to the world of art. he chose to borrow an artwork of broad popular appeal and easy name recognition. He's also known to favor French Impressionists, but largely for their monetary worth. So we know that from his biographer, Timothy O'Brien, who recalls Trump bragging about a Renoir painting in his possession. And you can see that painting hanging on the left image in the Trump house, where Melania is being interviewed in that image, in that still. But Trump has bragged that this Renoir painting is an original worth $10 million, when in fact, art historians who know this Renoir's work will recognize it as a picture of, as a canvas hanging in the Art Institute of Chicago. So just this year, another Van Gogh landscape painting sold at auction for over $8 million. So there's a kind of like high worth of these French artists that seems to be central to Trump's interest in them. That makes snagging landscape with snow for your private home as a perk of the job a really nice deal if you want to borrow Trump's own investment rhetoric. Catalan's America, though, is just as valuable as an artwork, though for reasons entirely different from Van Gogh's landscape. America, the sculpture, America's unquestionable worth is here not market-made, but literally embodied in raw materials, solid gold, estimated to cost well over $1 million. When Nancy Spector, the museum's curator, suggested the piece as an alternative to the Van Gogh, she was hardly sympathetic to Trump's interests. Rather than counter-offering, say, another Van Gogh painting or another post-impressionist landscape, that would have been the more art historically minded kind of swap, she decided to treat this transaction not as an art historical mindset, but in a purely economic one. So besides pulling off a pretty good joke, she also substituted one sound investment for another. The email exchange, which I showed earlier, even highlights specifically, she says, that this Catalan work is extremely valuable. Gold is indeed of late a very sound investment. When Spector offered Trump the Catalan, this is back in September in 2017, the precious metal was trading well above investor expectations, having climbed with only minor dips from, this is like a chart of gold being traded. So here you have, I just pulled this, so this is the price of gold between January of 2017 to the present, and you can see January being when Trump was inaugurated. You can see between January and this is September, so it's kind of like at its peak in 2017. So into September 2017, the precious metal had climbed with only minor dips from $1,130 per troy ounce to $1,450 in the 9 months since Trump's inauguration. And so there is some irony in the fact that the president had himself to thank for the rising material value of this artwork that he is then refusing. Trump has, in fact, been known to invest in gold as part of his portfolio. In 1975, when the U.S. legalized private ownership of gold again, Trump apparently aggressively bought the metal, later selling it at great profits, so he claims. We're not sure. Gold is not a typical medium of Catalan's repertoire. So he is most famous for his politically provocative installations employing wryly subversive humor. He first made international headlines with this flashy, hyper-real sculpture of Pope John Paul struck down by a meteorite. Catalan has made no secret as well of his distaste for the world of high finance. One of his most visible pieces is his 2010 LOVE, a site-specific installation featuring a 13-meter high middle finger standing in front of the stock exchange in Milan's Piazza Affari. Here, as with America, materials make a difference. This obscenely gesturing hand is beautifully sculpted out of white Carrara marble, that sort of material of national pride and classical importance, but selected to match in tone the 1932 fascist-era building that serves as its backdrop. Catalan has called this piece an anti-fascist statement, since the hand would have been making a Nazi salute had the artist not amputated the other fingers. But installed in the wake of the financial crisis where it sits, it's hard not to see the piece as equally issuing a rather monumental FU to the financial institution in front of which it stands. Despite its controversial reception, the artist somehow managed subsequently to convince the city of Milan to keep this piece on permanent display, stipulating that it must remain in its current location. So originally it was part of a temporary site-specific work. With its title, an acronym, so the title is LOVE, and I've put that in the, you can see in the caption that it's an acronym for the Italian words for freedom, hate, vengeance, and eternity. So with this title, Catalan parodies a more familiar work of similar title, Robert Indiana's love sculptures that grace public plazas around the world. Catalan's austere cold marble in place of taking over that title over the playfulness of Indiana's shiny polychrome aluminum, though I noticed in Alex's talk that actually there's also core tint versions. Catalan's material awareness is very much at play in America, which I would argue is undoing the symbolism of gold itself. America is not without art historical precedent. It, of course, pays homage to Marcel Duchamp's fountain of 1917, the most important instance of plumbing as sculpture in the history of art. Interestingly, both toilets were conceptualized by European artists for a New York audience, and both were seen as synonymous with an idea of Americanness. So when Duchamp debuted Fountain, Beatrice Wood, writing in his defense, proclaimed that, quote, the only works of art America has ever given are her plumbing and her bridges. As a ready-made, Duchamp's urinal was an industrial thing chosen from the everyday context and inaugurated into the rarefied world of art. This process of recontextualization that Duchamp orchestrated rendered his urinal dysfunctional. So, he deliberately turned it on its side, he signed it, he put it on a pedestal. Catalan's America follows, we might say, the opposite trajectory. The gold toilet is sculpture in the traditional sense of its craftsmanship and materials. The object was modeled after toilets from the Guggenheim's bathrooms, 2 of which were sent to Italy for the purpose. These models were disassembled and cast in 18-karat gold, which then had to be welded back together to create the finished work. So in material behavior and technical process, gold casting bears little resemblance to ceramic or acrylic casting, the standard methods by which toilets are made. 18-karat gold, it's an alloy of pure gold mixed with 25% silver and copper, and it has to be melted down before pouring. It has a kind of pliability, so gold is a particularly malleable metal, and in 18-karat it's not the softest, as soft as pure gold, but it also is relatively malleable. And therefore, this is why gold is preferred for intricate metalwork, and rather than for the broad surfaces of bathroom fixtures. As well, its density and cost, of course, usually precluded from its use in large format sculpture. America is thus a highly crafted artwork of fine materials that has been downgraded, reduced to everyday plumbing. Produced in collaboration with the Guggenheim, the piece debuted there in 2016, but inside a pre-existing single-use bathroom on the museum's 5th floor. Installed without much special fanfare, it was displayed with inconspicuous signage. Out of view of guards and cameras, America served for all practical purposes as a bathroom fixture that happened to be inside a major art museum. Invited to preview the work, a critic for the Guardian newspaper reported that, quote, "the surface proved forgiving on the rear of the thigh. And once the procedure was complete, the flesh worked like a charm." So not your typical art criticism, especially when the writer goes on to confirm that, yes, the, quote, "the gold toilet was able to handle solids." So gold, a material synonymous with money and with other valued treasures, is here reduced to an instrument of bodily waste disposal. And when the Guggenheim staff, when it was on display, they had to clean it every 15 minutes at the chief conservator's recommendation. And I'm sure that those staff that were assigned that task didn't feel like they were having this the aesthetic experience of working with a gold work of art, even though they had to use special wipes. So flush by flush, we might say, this artwork humiliates gold. If the status of gold is at stake here, then what about the material's monetary identity? And this is what I want to turn to next. The very thing that makes this piece so extremely valuable in the first place. Gold has, of course, served as currency for thousands of years, but the particular confluence of art and commerce that Catalan's work speaks to resonates most with modern debates about the nature of money, which date to the later decades of the 19th century. It was in these years that gold's cultural meaning was most subject to redefinition, some celebrating its intrinsic value, while others denigrating its position in the monetary world in the first place. This is also an era that, I would argue, resonates with Trump's ethos. As a New York business elite with a love of grandeur and penchant for conspicuous consumption, Trump is a reminder of the self-made robber barons who, like him, championed government deregulation at that time. And this is just comparison of Trump's residence with William Vanderbilt's New York residence in the late 19th century, to give you a sense of the sort of aesthetic links. The Trump-Guggenheim tussle registers in parodic form, then, the great monetary debates of the Gilded Age. Should money be synonymous with gold? In industrialized nations for much of the 19th century, there was a gold standard, meaning that you could take your cash to the bank and exchange that paper bill for a fixed amount of gold. Paper money was tied to a limited supply of bullion kept in bank vaults. Questions of hard and soft money, gold versus paper, as currency, were at the center of monetary politics in the late 19th century United States, and these debates pivoted around the function and nature of gold as a material. So in the United States, where the gold standard in the United States, the gold standard had been interrupted by the Civil War. As an emergency measure, the government had issued paper money that was not backed by any precious metal in bank vaults. And after the war, after wartime, these bills, which are called greenbacks, whether they should continue to use these bills was really a major political issue. On one side of this debate were conservative bullionists. They were often the so-called gold bugs, who advocated for the resumption of the gold standard to prevent inflation and to bolster the strength of the dollar. And on the other side of this debate were greenbackers, who argued that unbacked circulation would stimulate the economy, particularly given the scarcity of cash in outlying territories. So, this election map, sort of election forecast map, dating from 1896, clearly shows the geographic distribution of those who favored golds versus the free coinage of silver, which, to put it very, I don't have time to go into it in depth, but there was a silver, a very large influx of silver from mining. So those who wanted to introduce silver as a second form of bullion were actually kind of aligned with greenbackers, believing that scarcity of metal, of precious metal, should not be a factor in the government's printing of money. So you can see that the gold advocates are the tail of this dog, which is basically the industrialized Northeast, whereas the sort of economically depressed South and the less settled West are advocates of, are sympathetic to greenback, the idea of using the greenback. And of course, then the Midwest is kind of like swing states. So even though the gold standard was officially restored in 1879, the currency debate persisted due to economic booms and busts, and it's actually peaked at this time in 1896, following the Panic of 1893. And gold became such a crucial symbol in that election that McKinley, who eventually won the presidency, who was a gold standard advocate, over the populist candidate, William Jennings Bryan, is shown here on his campaign poster being held up by the American citizens on this gold coin. So it was so the idea of gold, the gold standard, was absolutely central to his campaign. The gold standard debate centered, in other words, on the materiality of money. In both economic texts and popular journalism, the properties of gold versus paper were regularly raised on both sides. Advocates for the gold standard like to point out that paper was material, and as a material was worthless, a flimsy substitute for real value. So here is a political cartoon in which there's a figure of a gold coin marked specie in the foreground, as you see, and he has cast this little coin figure, has cast a shadow, which is hard to read, but in the shadow is written greenback. And this image comes from a satirical novel called Robinson Crusoe's Money by David Wells, in which it chronicles a kind of imagined economic history of this fictional island. And it talks about its evolution from barter to gold money to eventually adopting paper currency, which ruins everything. So, and in that text, accompanying this image is an explanation of it that goes: the citizens of Crusoe's island lost much real wealth by trying to make the shadow of wealth supply the place of its substance. The image thus represents gold as real wealth and paper money as an insubstantial representation, a kind of illusion or shadow of real value. Elsewhere in the book, Wells actually compares the production of paper money to artists making representations. And during that period, the same period, there was an extremely popular form of art, trompe-l'oeil still lifes, that featured banknotes, paper money, and in fooling your eye into believing these were real, these artists were also playing on the rhetoric of paper money as merely an illusion. So to go back to Catalan's work then, We could say that America, his toilet, may appear sympathetic to the bullionist position that I've just discussed, as it is without a doubt what David Wells, the author of Robinson Crusoe's Money, calls real wealth. But its solid gold with its solid gold composition, it even demands to be read against. With its solid gold composition, it even demands to be read against more typical gold furnishings, the kind found in Gilded Age mansions and Trump's living room, in which gold is on the surface alone. So gilding, or the process of covering other materials with a thin layer of gold leaf, is in fact what inspired Mark Twain to dub the age of surfaces, the late 19th century, with its now familiar name of the Gilded Age. Because gilding hides cheaper materials under a showy skin, gilt interiors, gilt furniture, and other objects are an apt metaphor for monetary representation as it was understood by the advocates of hard money. Those bullionists seeing, so in comparison to these objects, Catalan's work is kind of the opposite. And bullionists would probably have loved his material integrity, the fact that it's solid gold throughout. Catalan, though, wants to be sure that our reverence for his gold sculpture feels misdirected, uncomfortable. And it is in this goal that he adheres more to a greenbacker's logic of gold money. So greenbackers, on the other hand, in this period of monetary debate, celebrated the abstraction of value in unbacked paper currency and argued that when monetized, gold was subject to inappropriate and problematic adoration. They accused bullionists of being quote-unquote gold fanatics and idolaters, so the term gold bug arrives out of that, and argued that demonetizing gold would de facto eliminate the need to hoard bullion, which became a major problem during economic downturns like the 1893 panic. So here you have like this image of all of the people running to the bank to exchange their money for gold in all of the countries affected by the panic, including Australia. The function of gold is to travel, wrote the greenbacker economist Arthur Kitson in 1895, to keep commodities moving. Whatever interferes with its function should be avoided. The money form should be free from unnecessary burdens. In other words, symbolically valuable, but materially worthless. Paper being exactly this, greenbackers reasoned, would never be hoarded, but would always be circulating because it wasn't actually worth squirreling away. The gold standard, greenbackers reasoned, only encouraged a reversion to a supposedly primitive interaction with precious materials. Only the barbarian, Kitson and others acclaimed, would, quote, attach value rather to the symbol than to the signification of shining and beautiful metal, to store them up and feast his eyes with rows of sovereigns arranged in order. So time and again, 19th century writers linked a kind of gold fanaticism to a primitive, pre-civilized condition. And in fact, at that time, India was understood as the de facto kind of land of hoarding gold. And they claimed that all the gold money in the global economy went there, where it was melted down into jewelry. So gold money, in other words, would only foster a form of material fetishism. This greenbacker view of gold is better aligned with Catalan's own politics. So the artist has jokingly referred to his gold toilet as 1% art for the 99%. And indeed, when installed in the Guggenheim, any museum visitor could experience the piece privately, despite their inability to personally possess a $1 million artwork. The monetary debates of the Gilded Age are rooted as well in class, because it was the industrialists and wealthy urbanites who most wanted to maintain the gold standard, whereas rural residents and the working class had a lot to lose with the scarcity of cash. In his in an important speech, the presidential candidate for the populist candidate of the 1896 election, William Jennings Bryan, argued against the gold standard by appealing to this rural working class. Thinking specifically about the social life of gold, he said, quote, "The miners who go down 1,000 feet into the earth or climb 2,000 feet above the cliffs and bring forth from their hiding places the precious metals to be poured into the channels of trade are as much businessmen as the few financial magnates who in a back room corner the money of the world." In other words, gold tethers the banker to the miner, the 1% to the 99. These miners, gold rushers to be precise, during this very election, there was a gold rush that began in the Yukon, occupied a fascinating position within this monetary debate because even though they were supporters of the populist cause that greenbacks were important, they actually even though they supported Bryan and getting rid of the gold standard, they were clearly driven, nevertheless, by a love of the materiality of gold because they were, against all odds, driven to excavate it from the ground and having a kind of idolatrous relationship to the material. And it's worth mentioning that actually Trump's real estate fortune has its origins in gold rush money because his grandfather as a young immigrant, went to the Yukon during the Klondike Gold Rush of the 1890s, not to mine gold, but to start hotels and restaurants for the miners that went there and making his fortune that eventually led to the Trump Corporation. Any case, surely Catalan was aware, that his artwork was quite literally built of hard money. America resembles, this is just a promotional image of that. America resembles a hoard of gold frozen from circulation. A toilet is both weighty and relatively permanent if properly installed, as it was at the Guggenheim. And in that high palace of art, it, in its own way, becomes a kind of cult object. Its Duchampian homage further boosts its quasi-mystical presence, as Fountain was once dubbed by Duchamp's circle a Buddha of the bathroom when it was first rejected from exhibition. And Alfred Stieglitz, whose photograph of that piece also anthropomorphizes it into a kind of saintly figure. So in a sense, Catalan has carried what greenbackers criticize as the fetishization of gold to its extreme, using it as to form an object associated with the bodily and with the sort of bodily experience. In offering it to the Trump White House, then, Catalan and Spector bring the nuances of a monetary history of gold to our contemporary consciousness. It may seem that debates about the gold standard are long behind us. After all, it was abandoned by Roosevelt back during the Great Depression. We need only remember that Trump's love for gold extends beyond his love of gilding. As a politician, he, alongside other conservatives, has been vocal about his desire to reinstate the gold standard despite its practical impossibility. In 2016, he was quoted saying, we used to have a very nice country because it was based on the gold standard, and we do not have that anymore. Had America, the artwork, actually made its way into the Trump White House, it would have essentially transformed one lackey bathroom on the one hand into a bank vault of sorts, and on the other into an ultimate space of bodily indulgence. So here I thought I would, so how disconcerting then to imagine national financial security embedded in an object whose primary function is to take deposits of a scatological nature. And I thought I would end by talking briefly about another failed negotiation. In 1981, Trump did a studio visit with Andy Warhol with the intention of purchasing artwork to decorate the soon-to-be unveiled Trump Tower lobby. Trump ended up rejecting a series of silk screens that the artist made for him. According to Warhol, quote, "Mr. Trump was very upset that it was not color coordinated. I think Trump's sort of cheap. I get that feeling." Rather than collect Warhol's work, Trump took to appropriating the artist's musings about art, regularly describing his own business dealings in Warhol's words. So in his self-congratulatory book on business success, Think Like a Champion, Trump writes, quote, "There's a certain amount of bravado in what I do these days, and part of that bravado is to make it look easy. That's why I've often referred to business as being an art. I always liked Andy Warhol's statement that making money is art and working is art and good business is the best art. I agree," end quote. Trump's appropriation of Warhol's tongue-in-cheek aphorisms in this almost charmingly naive kind of misunderstanding of Warhol's practice is a fitting way, I think, to think about the relationship of these two artists to the kind of conservatism of the Trump White House. So, and Warhol, of course, liked to put dollars on canvas. So I'll just leave you with this image, which is, I think, a way in which art is sitting, both of these pieces of art sit at a juncture of soft and hard money, of paper and gold, of a national kind of egalitarianism in contrast to the ultimate sort of bodily indulgence. Thanks.
So in thinking through your two papers, I was reminded of the chapter in Thomas More's Utopia concerning the attitudes of its inhabitants towards gold and other precious materials. And in this chapter, because the utopians have no need for money and they find iron more practical to make stuff out of, gold is held in relatively low esteem, a point that More brings home by claiming gold as the material that is chosen in Utopia to make chamber pots. So it probably shouldn't have come as a surprise that the two papers on gold would actually mainly be about shit. The sort of worms inside the gilded tomb, so to speak. In More's Utopia, gold is also, I think we should remember, what they used to make the shackles of slaves. And Anne, as your account of the West African gold trade so dramatically suggests, I think it's fascinating and provocative to think about how these kind of expressions of wealth and luxury can point to rather uglier realities of their production. So to this end, the first thread I wanted to pick up on is what you, Anne, referred to at one point as the polyvalence of gold, the tendency for its interpreters to fall into the kind of default terms of wealth and decadence, but its capacity to speak to a much more complex terrain of meaning. And I think the possibility for the material of gold to be valued and therefore devalued, both as a symbolic sign and as the basis for a monetary system, relies on this kind of malleability of its associations and the kind of resulting anxieties over the stability of those meanings that can produce. The second thread I wanted to pick up on concerns, Maggie, the topic or the issue of substitution, which is really central to your paper today, by which gold is kind of mobilized in systems of exchange in which one thing can stand for another or even be transformed into another kind of thing. As your paper alludes to, these are relations common both to the fiat decree of an unbacked currency and to the Duchampian ready-made. And I sort of like the idea that like conceptual art, like paper money, is the beginning of the end of, you know, civilization. And so the idea that the Duchampian ready-made kind of materializes in gold, I think kind of captures their shared value for art history and economic history. But I, you know, also, and in terms of your paper, the possibility for precious materials to become the constituents of pictorial representation, even, or perhaps especially when they're like really unsuited to do the stuff of becoming hairnets and things that they're not meant to be, I think participates in a similar kind of substitutionary logic. So I wanted to end by addressing a question from an issue raised by both of your papers to the other paper. So, Maggie, I wondered if you knew anything about the origin of the gold in the toilet and whether that matters or whether we're meant to think about that. And the answer might simply be no, and that's okay. But I found myself wondering in the wake of your paper where this stuff came from. And Anne, I wondered if you might say something further briefly about the class dimensions of gold in the period that you're dealing with, and if you have more to say, perhaps a little more on the kind of shifting art historical views about the significance of the material in these works, you know, post Panofsky and Gombrich, like what other people have to say about this stuff.
Well, the answer is no, which is why I need to think about it.
So, thank you.
You may have to flick it up. So you've got, yeah,
Is that it? Yeah. Good. So thank you for that. On the notions of polyvalence and substitution, one of the kind of interesting things to think about, in addition to the sort of pictorial aspects of it, is that the gold, in Mali, for instance, it's used in particular ceremonial ways, but it has no monetary value except that it's not used for currency. It has no economic value except that it allows a trade into a region that does have an economic, it's the equivalent of paper currency in a way, right? It only is valued when you can change it for something else because it has no inherent value there. The sort of historiography, to jump a little bit, it's funny that there was this moment when people were very much engaging with this notion of the International Gothic, and it really, it's a kind of default category in 100 different ways. So all of these kind of foundational figures write about it. And then it's like, we settle it into this notion, and this is mid-century too, so we've gone through that sort of moment of moving away from ornament. We've gone through the sort of Bauhaus. We're moving into truth to materials, Clement Greenberg. So, in Italy also, the part of what is pushed against is that this is not pure painting, right? So the problem is a blurring of one thing for another. It's a contagion, and some of it really is. I mean, some of the descriptions you get, it's like it always is some artist, usually an individual, who brings it in from elsewhere. It's always something that's brought in as a style, but also something that'll come to an end in a kind of exhaustion of itself. So, but it's kind of fallen away also in a way that period has fallen away. We don't talk much about the sort of 14th and 15th century anyway, because there's a lot that's sort of happening and changing. So in more recent historiography, there hasn't been a lot of treatment of it. And, and it's interesting to me in the wake of some of the discussions that, architects and others have been having around the notion of the Gothic as a category, as this kind of category of something that is constantly blurring and becoming one thing and another, and it's that potentially inability to stop and curtail that I think is actually interesting. And so part of what's interesting about this use of gold, and I'll stop after this, is that it very much is about one thing sort of constantly becoming another, even in your eyes, because you can't necessarily track it.
Okay, so I'm going to answer with more than just one word. So the answer is no, I don't think we know, and I don't think it matters, but I think the fact that it doesn't matter is important, because I think from the 19th century on, or even before that, but I think certainly from the 19th century moment of the debates about whether gold should be monetary, there is a way in which the value of gold as money is very much globally determined and globally inflected. So you saw that cartoon of like the run on the bank was not just in American banks, of course, it was banks all over the world at the same moment. And as well, the disappearance of the gold standard was all a kind of snowball effect with the Bank of England first demonetizing gold, and then so therefore all of these other countries followed suit. And I think there's a way in which the materiality of gold is part of that, and the idea of you have to, gold is constantly being melted down and formed into new things, so that it might be coin and then turned into sculpture, turned back into coin. And so that kind of liquidity, which is so part of the material condition of gold, plays into that. It's a sort of, it reminds us, I think, of gold's kind of ability to globally circulate and to shift identities.
So we're a bit over time.
We can carry on. And I hope everyone is okay with 20 minutes or so of discussion, because there are lots of questions. So questions, please, from out here.
Thanks. This is a question for Anne. I was just wondering, it seems like the relation to alchemy is there for the taking on any number of different levels, and to get into Eve Klein and so on and so forth. It could go endlessly, but two specific questions. One story that the historiography of alchemy has stressed is the role of a notion of the prolongation of life as being a iatrochemical / alchemical contribution. And I'm wondering if some of the thinking around gold that you're exploring is informed by that specific aim. Secondly, is the argument made by Bill Newman about the alchemical tradition, particularly in this moment, post pseudo-Geber, and the construction of an idea of alchemy as opposed to the visual arts, painting in particular, as having an ambition not to imitate nature, not to be in the mimesis business, but being in the business of perfecting nature. And it seems to me that there's something very interesting in the particular Gentile, Fabiano examples that you're pulling upon, where this play between these different modes of artistic ambition, that is the painter or the sculptor's mimetic ambition versus the alchemist's perfection ambition, are in a kind of lively oscillation between one another. And I'm just wondering if that's a historiography that you have in mind here, if you see that as relevant, and if that's something that you're trying to engage with and pull out.
So thank you for this, and I guess that gets a little bit also to the question of the class-based nature of this, which I forgot to sort of address. The sort of practical, the most direct, the most concrete answer is that you get discussions about what we would term sort of alchemical processes in relation to both health handbooks, lapidaries, so books about stones, and in relation to medicine, right? So, that line between the chemical, the alchemical, and the sort of everyday business of making stuff as a painter or an artist is a little more blurred than we would have in our terms. But the point you raise that, the one is about making something into something else, and the other is about trying to bring something to its final conclusion. At the root of all of it is the notion that all of this human activity is borrowing or sort of finishing the work that God in the end has started, right? So that what the artist is doing is basically being lent a little bit of the sort of stored divine power, in a sense, to make something, to perfect or turn something of it into something else. So the basic notion of alchemy, that you're taking something to the state it should reach in the end, in some ways is not as disconnected, maybe. And I guess that's why I'm interested in, these artists who seem to be gesturing in some ways along that logic, I would say. But, as you point out, coming to a mimetic end that is exactly not about making you aware of the thingness of the thing, if you see what I mean.
But it seems like what's particularly interesting in the Gentile example that you show is that you get both simultaneously, as it were, where you get the recognition, the display of the virtuosic command over creation of semblance out of base material with the manipulation of pigments suspended into varnishes to create illusionistic effects, blah, blah, blah. But then you also get the rupturing and the demonstration of the capacity to command that which is purified and perfected and to interrupt the illusionistic mimetic display with command of perfection. Like the alchemists drive, materialize simultaneously with the artist's mandate, something like this.
Yeah, I think as much as I understand your question, I think I agree with you, right? Like part of what's interesting and is the literalness, in some sense, of the ways the gold is being used in some cases, and the extreme unliteralness in others, which I think, as you say, is exactly about pointing along that spectrum. So, in that sense, but I would come back to this notion that some of those divisions, the artist in the practice is actually having to work through them practically day to day. So, there's the very practical business of doing and making, and then there's this kind of self-consciousness about that borrowing of a sort of power or perfecting or mimetic ability. And that's why I find it very interesting that there is this kind of pure gold, just kind of, and then there are all these other effects.
We have a couple of questions. We'll take one from the front and go to the back. Anne's at the back with a question.
Okay, thank you. Just a quick question or comment. I find it interesting how this morning we thought of mining as a process that involved the exploitation of resources and being violent to the earth and to the workers who dig the earth. And now it seems in some way that the material is sort of getting its revenge and being violent on people who actually use it. And both your papers had this dimension of humiliating people and killing people who ingest the gold. And so I was, you even, and you also talked about the gold ground as being kind of violent to the observers, that block them out. And so I just was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on this aspect of the revenge of the material.
I really like that idea, and it's a really nice way to tie the two together. I think what really interested me about this little episode with the Catalan work is that there's a sense of gold, on the one hand, because it has this monetary history, as entirely cleansed of the kind of bodily fetishism that we associate with the precious materials. You know, that because it's money, it can just be pure value, that it is somehow divorced from these kind of bodily linked meanings. And I think there was an effort in the 19th century debates to kind of separate that out. Is that really possible to separate it out? When you have gold money, do you automatically have to engage with it in this kind of more sensual way, I guess? Sensual in both positive and negative terms. And I think that is perhaps why I kind of wanted to think about the episode in the first place, because I think there is this way in which that episode and kind of that artwork embodies this kind of tension between gold's materiality as, on the one hand, a logical kind of equalizing monetary quantity, and on the other hand, this unknowability that is associated with a kind of fetishization and bodily relation.
Just before we get to our next question, do you want to say anything more about that?
Just very briefly, the Mouradian piece, which I find really interesting, that notion of the revenge of the material, it actually in some ways turns on that, because a number of the small things, it's quite a interesting, like he talks also about the song lines as the first kind of commodities of the Aboriginal peoples, right? There are a number of links he makes that are actually quite strange and provocative in some ways, because they could be traded and so on. But a number of the objects that are produced, the one that's coming to mind is, it's a little flat gold foil thing that apparently is used for plastic surgery on eyelids, to, double or single your eyelid, I can't remember which, and he's taken it and encoded it with the DNA sequencing, so again, that's this bit, right? With the notional DNA sequencing of the individual who's going to have this transformative beauty surgery or whatever made, right? But encoded all literally in the body, according to this fictive narrative, would be that earlier kind of ugliness in the gold forever, right? So there's a literalness in some ways about the nastiness of that never going away or something.
So we're going to go to another question at the back.
It seems that another work in which Warhol appears to be channeling an alchemical process is the oxidation paintings, where he does it copper oxide on the ground, and then he invites his visitors to piss, and the process of entering the market. I mean, most recently, some of those oxidation paintings have sold for well over $1 million. It seems a very alchemical process.
I'm glad you kept us resolutely in the bodily. Would you like to comment?
Just that, I really like that reference, and I'm trying to think about how to think about gold in those terms, because gold is not very reactive, actually. Unlike steel, it doesn't rust. So it's like this, perpetual shine is something that's often associated with gold. So I was trying to think about how to think about that in relation to your comment.
I'm just surprised we haven't had any umbilical cords of gold today yet.
The casting, you mean?
Greenberg's, what is it? It's Avantgarde and Kitsch. Someone going to give me the reference, right? His terms for understanding the relationship between art object and the market is as an umbilical cord of gold.
So we'll take John.
Sure. Thank you. Your papers together made me wonder about a naive question that in a way I feel like you've both already addressed, but it's about endings. Because on one hand, we hear about the end of the gold standard, and then there's the sort of collapse of gold in painting at the end of the 15th century. So I wonder whether you have, or if you have thoughts on the sort of cause and effect narratives about the way the materials is implicated in the endings of these sort of periods, the shifts from gold to paper and from sort of gold to realism, and what your reflections on those endings might be.
So, one very concrete thing is there are shifts in trade and declines in access to some of the products of these states. Like Sigillassa, for instance, is probably abandoned sometime, we think, in the 1390s. So, part of what's happening in the 15th century, although there's still lots of gold in lots of places, but there probably is a dip in volumes until New World gold comes in and all of a sudden gold is everywhere. So part of it may be practical, but it's also, you wonder if, having reached a point where you've taken all the properties of something that you possibly can, twisted them in as many possible ways, at that point,
to help you.
It ceases to help you, and in some ways the polyvalence drops away, right? And if that polyvalence is maybe fundamentally what gold does, because it doesn't let you in any way, you've got to push against it in 100 ways. That might be part of it.
I wonder if, the end of the gold standard, obviously with the end of the gold standard, gold becomes just like any other commodity that can be bought and sold, invested. Its price, there's like gold bubbles and so on. And I wonder if that is part of, I don't know, how that might relate to the use of gold as an artist material. I don't know, all of those examples that you brought up, for example, of artists thinking through the medium of gold. I don't know if that would be interesting to see how that shifts with the new identity of gold as a commodity.
I know you want to end this.
No, I don't. Not at all. I do not at all.
I'm just thinking about this idea of the kind of finality of it, and I'm thinking about this ceiling in the Vatican that was a gift of Ferdinand and Isabella, which is all this New World gold, taken straight up, but as a kind of gift, as a kind of intercession, really, isn't it? For a kind of more lasting, divine, intercession. So I'm wondering about this kind of spiritual quality of using gold as a way of trying to achieve a higher existence, or at least a desire, both for the obvious display of wealth, but also for maybe something more metaphysical.
Yeah. So one of the I mentioned Abbot Sujet, and part of the argument about the sort of transcendence is exactly that. In a way, the most, the golden calf. Gold is the most idolatrous medium, but it also is, the recalcitrance I spoke of is also. There's a way in which it actually stops your easy access, right? It complicates that. So if part of what you're worrying about in a visual system or a religious system is that idea that you'll start to venerate the materiality, ironically, gold would actually be one of the ways to disrupt that potentially. So that intercessory nature, Giuliana Bruno, who writes this book, I think literally it's called Surface, right? Yeah. And she's talking about this notion of a kind of social space, a kind of shared space. I found this really interesting to think about because, in a way, what gold does in these cases, and sealing also physically is very difficult, right? Is to disrupt that easy relation. And if that intercessory relation is something theologically you're supposed to be working for, right? Then this actually makes material that difficulty in some order, maybe.
Other question? I mean, I feel that we, in the era of
cryptocurrency and the progressive dematerialization of all forms of currency. I mean, paper is like pretty real compared to other forms of currency currently in operation. But gold is still being talked about as a kind of end-time preparation. There is something bizarrely, because it's a hedge. It's a, you're supposed to go bury some gold somewhere, and because one day when, the zombies are on the loose, we're all going to need something that's real, because imminently our currency system is going to collapse. And this is, the coming collapse of our financial system has been a much, told about trope, and 2008 was just the latest iteration. I wonder whether gold sort of, has this awfully ambivalent position, because it sort of, to need gold is to be in trouble, in some ways. I mean, we know that it's a hedge against, having to be expelled from countries. We know it's, people make it portable so they can take it on them. I wonder about the sort of emergency nature of gold as something to think about and how it's used.
I mean, I want to be, I know we're kind of trying to wrap up, but I feel like there is something about that idea of hoarding your gold, which is really interesting in the context of mining, of course, because it's all about burying it back in the ground. I mean, in like you don't have to literally bury it, but there is a sense of like
most
astounding.
Of it is underground in
yeah, like hiding it away. And also just a interesting thing to think about is that with the increasing dematerialization of currency, of course, virtual currency, Bitcoin, and so on are all mined. So despite that very dematerialization, there is a kind of rhetorical interest in returning to the notion of gold money.
Okay, well, because tomorrow we will certainly be talking about kind of a wide and metaphorical understanding of mining. Mining as understood to be a mining of images, mining in its most complex forms, if you like, as well as extraction. So that's an excellent place to leave us for the evening. And I just want to thank all of you for staying with us till right at the end, and all our speakers, especially our panelists. Please come back tomorrow for more mining.